The good news of Jesus Christ according to the Gospel of St. Mark in chapters 2 and 3. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, what are they doing? What is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need of food? He entered the house of God when Abiathar was high priest and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priests to eat, and he gave some to his companions." Then he said to them, "The Sabbath was made for humankind, and not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Again he entered the synagogue, and a man was there who had a withered hand. They watched him to see whether he would cure him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man who had the withered hand, "Come forward." Then he said to them, "Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to kill?" But they were silent. He looked around at them with anger and was grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately conspired with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
Please be seated. In my senior year of seminary, I was accustomed to packing in my Sundays as many supply preaching opportunities as I could. But when I did not have a supply preaching engagement scheduled, I would attend Holy Trinity Lutheran Church in Dubuque, Iowa. It was within walking distance of the seminary, so of course I drove. And I would come in a little late, what I call Lutheran time. I saw some of you this morning. I know you're on Lutheran time. And when I'm not leading up front, I'm accustomed to sitting in back. I'm one of those kinds of Lutherans. I like it in the back. And kind of take in all that's going on. See what's happening. This particular Sunday evening worship, as I was sitting in the back, worship was unfolding as it usually would. Of course, we sang together, we prayed together, we heard the word together. The pastor was giving a sermon that evening, one that was really quite engaging. He had pre-recorded himself and had kind of a dialogue going on between his real self and the recording. In the congregation that night, about 4 or 5 pews ahead of me, there was a young mother with a little boy, about 2 years old or so. Very small and very fast. At one point, he got away from her and made a beeline for the pastor who was preaching. The pastor's eyes got wider and wider as this little guy came forward. He didn't know what to do. Everything was timed out. There was no room for error in his sermon. But even quicker than that little boy was an older woman who was sitting in front of the younger woman. And just like that, she got up, chased that little guy down, and right at the foot of the altar, scooped him up in her arms and returned him to the mother. I was impressed, and I thought, wow, she's really fast. And very kind, I thought, too. But as she handed that little one back to the mother, she proceeded during this sermon to chew her out for losing control of her son. The whole thing interrupted the sermon. As a seminarian, I felt awful for the preacher that night. But even worse was the young woman who burst into tears, apologized, took her son, and left. Walked out in the middle of worship. And aside from the sermon, it got very quiet in that sanctuary that night. And as I looked around, I realized that was the only kid we had there that night. The silence and worship of the absence of children is something that haunts me. One who loves kids, one who came up through ministry doing youth ministry. At the time, I sat in that pew and I thought, oh no. What is a church? What is worship? What is Sabbath? Without kids making noises, crying out in happiness or displeasure. I've always been of the mind that one of the marks of vitality for a congregation is its youth ministry and youth being present and involved in worship in all kinds of different ways. I had a lot to think about as I left worship that night. It was a remarkable Sabbath in a number of ways. And one of the questions that I came out of that worship, that Sabbath, was, what is Sabbath for? Not that. Not what I saw that night. I don't think we think about Sabbath too much. Maybe we think about Sundays, we think about going to worship, but Sabbath is a whole nother thing, and it's a big thing. And in this past week, as I've been looking at this, it's a big thing in this text that we have for today. No less than 7 times, the word Sabbath is in this text. And it's a Bible study technique to pay attention to what is repeated. 7 is an important number. It's a number of creation, isn't it? And that number and this word Sabbath bring us back. Bring us back to a whole nother world, the Old Testament world, the first Sabbath, the very first of our biblical stories. God created for 6 days, and then God observed a Sabbath. God took a rest. So what's at stake in this gospel story is a part of what's foundational to the faith. Sabbath is one of our first stories. It is a creation sort of story. Maybe you've wondered before, God, who is omnipotent or all-powerful, God who made all these great things, everything over that 6-day period, the way the story goes, why would God, who is all-powerful, need to rest? Ever thought about that? Ever asked that question before? We do believe God is all-powerful. It's an Old Testament theology. It's really the first one that comes out of the creation of the universe, but in the Old Testament they refer to God as El Shaddai, which means God all-powerful, or God Almighty. Just this morning, as we welcome Kimberly into the congregation, we said our words of faith together, our creed. We said, I believe in God the Father Almighty. Not kind of mighty, not mostly mighty, 51% mighty, or 6 out of 7 days mighty, but almighty. So why would God need to rest? It's not for God's sake, but it's for others' sake. It's for our sake. God rests on the Sabbath as a model for us. We who are not almighty, And yet we who are involved in the creative process, the creation that is still unfolding, that God is still working, that God has included us in. We're in that work that's a part of our discipleship, bringing about the kingdom that God is still unfolding. We do need to rest. We do need to recharge. And again, partially for ourselves, so that we can stay healthy, but stay healthy for what? Not so much for ourselves, but again, for others. That's what the work of the kingdom is all about. I think that's part and parcel to that very first story. And I think it's part of the conflict that's going on here in the gospel as well. Who is the Sabbath for? Is it for a certain set of rules and those who would strictly adhere to them, or is it for those who are in need? And Jesus gives the answer. It's a big deal, the Sabbath, because it's part of our foundational story, but it's also one of the big 10, isn't it? The Decalogue, the 10 Commandments, and depending on how you number them, third or fourth, the day of the Sabbath comes early, right after our commandments to God and our relationship that define how we interact with God, that God is the only God, that we don't take God's name in vain. Then comes keeping the Sabbath day and observing it, remembering it, keeping it holy. That came in the Moses story, long after the creation story, but there it was codified as a commandment that we shall keep it. Now, it's a commandment, it's a law, and at first that might come at us as something kind of heavy that demands something of us. Yes, we are to keep it, we are to remember it. But for those Hebrews, those Israelites with Moses who first received those commandments, they had been slaves under Pharaoh almost to time immemorial. When they heard that they get a day off, that was the first day off that they had gotten since they could remember. It was good news. Good news that they weren't slaves anymore, day in and day out. But there was one day that they got to rest and remember that they weren't slaves anymore, that God had freed them to worship God. It was a whole new identity for them. And that's a big part of what is at stake for the Pharisees. Why they have such a big problem with the disciples and with Jesus doing these things that they do, although they are good things clearly. Jesus and the disciples are breaking the law. A law that defined these people for so very long. It was their identity. They were the law abiders, the commandment keepers. This is what defined them in their relationship with God. And so it wasn't something to be trifled with. And they knew very well that as soon as even the smallest infraction occurred, it would be that much easier for that infraction to happen again, and even bigger ones to happen. There's a slippery, sliding slope where eventually they would lose that. Lose that part of their identity, lose that part of their relationship with God, that part of the covenant with God. So we cannot take the Pharisees too lightly. We can't just put them in a box where we say, they were just overzealous about the rules. It's a lot more than that that's at stake. And doesn't Jesus know it? He's redefining the Sabbath. He's not asking them to not keep it anymore, not remember it, not observe it, but he's asking them to keep it and observe it in a whole nother bigger way, a way that fits the kingdom, a way that is not for the law just itself, but for others. The Sabbath is for feeding the hungry. The Sabbath is for healing the sick. The Sabbath is for others. The Sabbath is the Lord's day, but not just 1 out of 7. More like 7 out of 7. Isn't every day the Lord's day? Isn't every day the day to do God's work? Isn't every day the Sabbath? Yeah, it happens on Sunday, but I think it stands to happen every other day as well. A week after that particular Sunday at Holy Trinity, when I observed that tragedy, I returned to worship in the evening. Got there a little early. I'm not sure why. That's kind of weird, huh? But I was in place when that older woman and her husband returned. And accompanying them was the younger woman and her son. They all went into their same general area as they were last week, but this time they were not sitting in separate pews. This time they were sitting together. And between the older woman and the younger woman sat the little boy. And throughout that worship, both women tended to this fast little guy. Kept him occupied, kept him engaged, right next to each other. It was beautiful. I got to say, my broken heart over that previous Sunday was mended and overflowed with what I saw. And what had happened was somewhere between those Sundays. What happened was Sabbath. God's people coming together, working together, not for themselves, but for each other, for the other. That's Sabbath. Amen.